All right. Do I have to start again? Okay. All right. Okay. Well, thank you very much for joining us on this wonderful session, the next session in our Honours System series. My name is Roger Smethurst. I'm a Deputy Director inside the Cabinet Office. I have responsibility for Public Records Act compliance and also for the running of the Government's Official History Programme. So most of what I deal with is historical. We are very, very lucky today to be joined by Toby Harper, who is an author, a historian, and associate professor or assistant professor at the University of Arizona. He's a leading expert on the social, political, and cultural history of the modern British honours system. And he's also the author of a fantastic book entitled From Servants of the Empire to Everyday Heroes. Before he starts, I just want to let you know that there will be an opportunity for question and answers at the end of his presentation. So, Toby, thank you very much for joining us today, and I'll let you get on with it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And to share this, thank you. So, I'm going to start. Here's the cover of that book. So I'm going to start with a story that relates to one of the incidents depicted on the cover. Thank you all for being here, and I'm really grateful to the Cabinet Office for inviting me to come give this talk. This is the product of research that began during my PhD thesis at Columbia University in the 2010s. And it's actually really kind of, I did a lot of this research in London in 2010, 2011, and it feels great to be back here talking about it to you. So, early in the Second World War, a man named Captain David Evan Rees was honoured by the British state for his service as a merchant sailor by being made an MBE, or Member of the Order of the British Empire. In June 1965, he angrily returned the medal. He no longer wanted to be in the order because Harold Wilson's Labour government had made all 4 Beatles MBEs, as depicted on the cover of my book. The inclusion of the 4 rock stars, according to Rees, had taken value away from the Order of the British Empire, the medal he had once, the honour he had once prized. Another holder of the honour wrote that he was disgusted by the appointment of the Beatles. However, others defended the Beatles' MBEs. Alec Douglas-Hume, the Conservative Leader of the Opposition, joked that they deserved their honours for single-handedly preventing a dollar crisis the year before. One correspondent of the Daily Telegraph said that, while she preferred Bach to pop, the older generation should be thankful that their message is nothing more harmful than money can't buy me love, even if they are inconveniently noisy about it. Ivan de la Beer, an expert on the honours system, scolded people like Rees for a different reason. Anyone who tried to return their medals would remain on the roll of the Order of the British Empire and would not be taken off, regardless of what they did with their medal. The gesture, he said, is meaningless. From the perspective of de la Beer at the time, this may have seemed true, but my book and my research showed all the ways in which gestures like this by people from a range of social classes and backgrounds in Britain and in the British Empire had meaning, and how this meaning changed the way in which, or changes the way in which we should think about the relationship between honours and British history more broadly. And I'd argue partly that it's gestures like these that gave the MBE and all the many other honours in the British system, and indeed gave the monarchy and the relationship between people in the monarchy itself their meaning, their social and cultural meaning. All about these different kinds of the politicians, officials, neighbours, friends, and enemies used out of seeing how the system worked in the 20th century. So most of this talk is going to be about some key changes. But before I talk about that, I want to talk about this word system and what it means to think about honours. And there are three different senses, or three different kinds of system that I want to suggest are useful for thinking about what British are. And the first is a hierarchical system of titles and orders. It's a system of relationship, networked hierarchy of different honours with honours of names. Yeah, all these different sort of word of titles that and postal can acquire. This has meanings. It's interesting in the hierarchical system. Interesting in that all of these are kind of arranged in relation to one another as part of order of precedence. The kind of verification they determine the order of precedence. Small, principle, it's clear. It's something where you can map out all the different relationships. There are honours here which this arrangement has changed. This network has changed over time. Honours here which are now dormant or extinct, and there are honours that were created during the 20th century. I didn't put the George Cross on here, but that's more recent. And there are other more recent creations or revivals that happened throughout the 20th century. This is kind of interesting because it's sort of things come and go. There's a sort of complex network of titles. At the time, this is also not really about the people. So the second sense in which I think you can think about the honour system is as a system of relations between people and between groups. To take these type honours and then think they represent in terms of the people. These titles and honours are kind of serve partly as a kind of model for thinking about relation, but they also had effects on the actual the much more complex society that they acted on. So yeah, we can also think about the honour system. I think I have a. And this is illustrating the hierarchy that even within individual orders, you have hierarchies. Your hierarchies within hierarchies. But in terms of the relationships between groups, I'm not sure how visible this will be on your screens. But this is a representation of who gets what honours has changed over time. This graph, or this table, sorry, specifically refers to within Britain, which civilians are getting the Order of the British Empire. So there's a subset of the Order of the British Empire in the 20th century. What you can see here is that the proportion of different kinds of service actually changes quite a lot. I'll come back to the specific changes, but I think this is really interesting because it means that you've got this fixed network of different honours, but they're actually doing different things over time. What they're being used to do is changing over time. One of the really important dimensions of British honours is that it is about both this and about hierarchy. It's about both hierarchy and it's about service. That there are two elements to this. That if you receive an award in the Order of the British Empire, you're receiving it for doing something, but you're also receiving an MBE, an OBE, CBE, D or KBE, or a GB. There are these different ranks, and these correspond to some kind of judgment about the kind of magnitude of service, but also the kind of hierarchy, in effect, the hierarchy that the recipient belongs to. And this was pretty explicit at the beginning of the century. When the Order of the British Empire was created in 1917, one of the internal documents talking about this used the example of an admiral versus a midshipman on a ship. If they both did something that deserved an honour in the Order of the British Empire, the midshipman would get an MBE, the admiral would get a GBE. This is the same service would produce a different result, and it works differently now. But at the time, this was how it was conceived. The third sense in which I want to think about honours today, though, is the honour system as a process. That this isn't just about a kind of system of relations between people or a hierarchy. This is also about, think of systems as engineers or biologists would conceive of them. That you have inputs, you have a process, and then you have outputs. In this case, the input is not coming from nominations or some form of nomination. Again, that changes over time. You've got this process through which these nominations become decisions, become then letters that go out to people, and finally people get the honours at the end of this process or towards the end of this process. I've mapped out here in very, very general terms how this process works. You get nominations, these kind of committees, you get political review, or royal assent, people get a letter from the Prime Minister. There's an announcement, a public announcement in the London Gazette, publicity around that announcement. There's a royal investiture, and then the person has that honour for the rest of their lives, barring unusual circumstances. So this is also a helpful way of thinking about honours, because while the general outline of this process has stayed fairly consistent through the 20th century, certain key factors in how it works have changed. There are kind of, and when this process changes, this has big ramifications for the system as a whole. Okay. So I want you to keep these, as I talk for the rest of this talk, I want to keep these three different ways of conceiving the honour system as a system in mind, because I think they're all things that change, and they're all interrelated, but they also are, I think all three of them are important ways in which you can kind of think about and understand the kind of wider historical meaning and importance of the honour system. Okay, so I'm really going to focus today on the Order of the British Empire, and here's a kind of great image from close to the creation of the Order of the British Empire. This is from 1919. The Order of the British Empire was founded in 1917. So this is from the first big wave of people who received the Order of the British Empire. This is a Maori woman in New Zealand named Pura McGregor, and she received an MBE in 1919 for running a kind of voluntary support, like entertainment and welfare service for soldiers in the First World War. And this is one of the main areas in which people were honoured by the Order of the British Empire in its early years. And this is part of a series of photographs that were taken of early Order of the British Empire recipients in both in Britain and in New Zealand. Actually, the other cover image of my book also comes from the same series. It's held by the Imperial War Museum. And I'm really interested in the choice the photographer has made here in posing this, because they took two photographs of McGregor. One kind of going into the props cabinet and getting out kind of traditional Maori dress, portraying her as a kind of pre-colonial Maori maiden, and the other of her as a kind of modern matron, a kind of modern a modern woman in modern dress. So this image deliberately kind of connected her membership in the Order of the British Empire with both a kind of present day modernity and with a kind of traditional past. So this is kind of a creative move by this photographer, or by whoever made this decision to do this photograph like this. But it gets at something that I think is really important to understanding honours, and that is both the ways in which they're looking back at the past, they're drawing on tradition, but also the ways in which they're new, the ways in which they change things. And the Order of the British Empire in 1917 is very much a new honour. So in 1913, a few hundred men and a much, much smaller number of women throughout the British Empire received honours. This is a very small number of people, and a very small number of people could expect to even have an interest in the honor system, could expect to receive honors. 5 years later, or 6 years later, by the time that this photo was taken, the total number of civilian honors being given out by the Crown was orders of magnitude higher. It was in tens of thousands at the end of the First World War. So the creation of the Order of the British Empire massively expanded the number of people receiving honors and the social, and perhaps more importantly, the social range of people who could receive honors. It took it from being something that was mostly for an elite to being something that middle class Britons and people in the British Empire could at least aspire to receive. As I said before, this was done in order to acknowledge the civilian voluntary effort towards the end of the First World War. This was kind of there's a lot of controversy around this as well. This is pretty complicated because there are a lot of people who weren't that keen on the way in which government was doing this. But it was this key moment in the history of the honours system because of this enormous expansion of the number of people who were eligible for honours, as well as the number of people who were receiving them. Immediately, I would argue, it depends on how you define importance. But I would argue that this immediately makes the Order of the British Empire the most important component of the honours system, because it was the one that reached the most people. It was one of the biggest numbers. This new order was both kind of modern in its approach to who was celebrated as a hero, but also kind of reflected an older structure of how society was ordered. As I said before, this was very much a hierarchical order. In fact, in certain ways, it was the most hierarchical order because it had the most different ranks in which people could be awarded things. So there's a sort of fundamental tension at the heart of the British honours system in the 20th century between these two kind of components, the hierarchy and the merit, between it had this dual, the order had this dual identity. Its numbers and social reach meant that thousands of recipients and millions of potential recipients were now invested in this system of rank. They had previously been outside of really their everyday concern. However, for others, especially but not limited to traditional elites, this outpouring of honour was kind of maybe a sign of social disintegration, corruption, and a loss of respect for social distinction. So there is a big corruption scandal right after the First World War that's sort of closely connected to honours. It's actually more about the peerage and about high honours, but the Order of the British Empire kind of gets associated.
I'm very sorry, but I think we're going to actually have to leave the building because we have a fire alarm going on here at the moment.
Attention.
Just wait for the...
This is an emergency announcement.
Okay, I'm very sorry, but we are going to have to end this podcast. I'm very sorry. Thank you very much for attending.